Good morning. I want to introduce our guest speaker. I get a lot of my ideas from, it's a really good news program called Democracy Now! So if you want to really get an in-depth view of news and have really interesting speakers, a lot of academics and poets and musicians and thoughtful people from around the world, because you get these little sound bites in the mass media, but if you want to go in depth. So last year I saw our guest speaker on Democracy Now! And I thought he'd be really interesting to bring to Taft. And as it turns out, he's coincidentally the cousin of my former advisee at Milton Academy years ago, Mashonagus Mills, who was a Wampanoag Native American and a sacred dancer. And so this is really cool. So our guest speaker this morning is English professor Mwalim Peters, known professionally as Mwalim the Funky Professor. He's an American recording artist, a songwriter, producer, playwright, poet, author, documentarian. From the Bronx, New York, Peters was raised in the Bronx, but as well as Mashpee, Massachusetts. So he's from the Wampanoag tribe. He's a mixed genre recording artist who performs new jazz, Afro house, and soul. He first broke into the music industry in 1990. So you can find out more about him. I'm sure a lot of your interests you may be interested in some of the things he's all about. And you can meet with him in the faculty room following today's Q&A. So I want to welcome him. He'll be here in about 1 minute. He's here right now. There he is. Welcome, Professor Peters.
That was better than the coffee. All right. Waniki sug, Natasuwis Mwalim, Nin Masipu Wampanoag. What I just said to you in Wampanoag is good morning. My name is Mwalim. I'm Mashpee Wampanoag. Now that's part of my family story. That's my father's side. My mother's family came from Barbados. I grew up with both cultures, grew up in the middle of both cultures. There's a concept that is American, and it's called exceptionalism. And it's a game that's been played. And I'm going to pull the card on it. How many liberal arts are there? Somebody tell me. What are the liberal arts? Oh, can I say it again? All right. How many liberal arts are there?
2. 22. 6. 18. 24. 56.
All right. Next question. How many sciences are there? All right. I'm going to tell you guys the same thing I tell my students. You have a phone on you, right? Yes. Google's your best friend when faced with a question like that.
We don't have Wi-Fi in here.
Oh, man. Oh, well then. Sorry about that. Yeah. To answer the question, there are 7 liberal arts. There are 4 sciences. When you go to college, you might go into the School of Liberal Arts, or you might go into one of the 4 sciences. The reason I asked that question, if I asked that question in an elementary school in Barbados, they could have answered me. If I asked that question in an elementary school in a so-called third world country, they could answer that question. How come we can't?
Was that a rhetorical question?
Oh, I'm looking for an answer.
Well, I think from the perspective of a TAP student, there's a level of exposure which kind of blends subjects to the extent
Oh, yeah. But the larger exposure and the intersectionality can best be recognized if you begin from your roots.
Well, would you say engineering isn't a science then?
Oh, it is. Well, I should say actually it's a product of science. It in and of itself is not. Because engineering contains just as much art as it does science. But we would need to first know the root to understand that intersection. You see what I'm saying? We are in American society based on commerce. And if it doesn't interact with commerce, and if it isn't somehow commercially viable, we don't see it as important. And understand that this is now a concept that goes throughout the levels of privilege. As I sit in front of students at Taft who didn't know the answer to that question and realize, okay, they have created that level. Now, why is that? Why do we relate to commodity? Or commodity first? John Rockefeller, I need a nation of workers, not thinkers. Why do we relate to commodity first?
It makes us feel good.
I'm sorry?
It makes us feel good.
Makes us feel good. Expand on that. What do you mean by that?
Having things makes us feel good.
Having things makes us feel good. Okay, but that's not necessarily commodity. Or I should say, that's not exactly the pure result of a commodity-based system. Because think of how many of us don't have things, but still exist in a commodity-based system. I'm sorry, who said it? Repeat. Oh, somebody said, no, I said, somebody just said something I couldn't quite hear them. Capitalistic economy, okay. Capitalistic economy. Now, before we were capitalistic economy, thank you. Thank you for that, because therein lies the root of the situation. When the Mayflower invaded the shores of my neighboring tribe, I'm from Mashpee, and it was the Herring Pond people who were in Plymouth, who were in what's now Plymouth. When the Mayflower invaded their shores, that was a trip of economics. That wasn't about religious freedom. That was about, can we start a farm? Can we make money from this land? Can we cash in on it? Can we, what's the current term, monetize this situation? That's what that was about. When the ships landed in Virginia, that was about monetizing a situation. It had nothing to do with religion. That's been a cloak-screen for centuries and centuries. It had to do with monetizing. When your entire structure is based on monetizing, you've been dehumanized. And it makes it easier to dehumanize, which then makes it easier to slaughter the people present on the land that you're now trying to monetize, which makes it possible to invade neighboring communities and take those people into bondage as well, which allows you to go to completely different lands, kidnap and torture and enslave those people into your economic venture. This is the root, part and parcel of the system. And then little by little, as you need to strengthen your forces, after you've now created, by the way, in case you guys didn't know, the first place to have legal definitions of race preceding the colonies turning into the United States was here, beginning with the documents that can be found in the Commonwealth of Virginia dating back to the 1600s. This is where the introduction of legal definition of racial category, because prior to that, race was determined by where you were from. The construct of the nation state, but then the concept of race as basically rooted in your ethnocultural identity, first place to have the legal definition was here. The federal documents were based on the documents in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and if you check the documents from the Commonwealth of Virginia, one of the interesting statutes you find is, but when people try to make the argument, oh, well, the Irish were slaves. Oh, well, some of the Scottish were slaves. No, they were actually indentured servants. There was a cap on the amount of time that they would be in service, and their children were born free. The Commonwealth of Virginia documents actually state and give permission that if you are Negro of Africa, you are chattel, which means you are property. And this chattel continues on to your children. Legal definitions that precede and shape the federal statement. The question of commodity. 7 arts and 4 sciences. Now, if you receive the proper education, as my young colleague pointed out earlier, if you receive the proper education, you will get a melange of all of those, and you'll be introduced to them. But how many people here have taken some form of auto shop? So 2 of us in the room, 3 of us? 2, 3, okay. 4, all right.
Can you repeat the question?
I said, how many of us have taken some form of auto shop class? Okay. If you have taken auto shop, you know that there's a considerable difference between knowing how to drive a car and knowing what makes the car work. True or false? If you understand your roots, your 7 arts and your 4 sciences, that's understanding what makes the car work, because you know the pieces now of the intersection. So now that you're aware of these things, and this is why I keep repeating them, these are the things that when you walk out of here, you can find out. Not to make me happy, but you're welcome. Any questions so far? All right. Commonplace. Art in the commonplace. What is art?
Self-expression.
Art is self-expression. Okay. So if somebody throws a brick through a window, that's art? It could be. Okay. By the way, anybody in the room know which philosopher it is who basically made her statement true? Art, a brick thrown through a window could be art. All right, my art people, look up Arthur Danto. Particular book, Transfiguration of the Commonplace. Art is expression. What else is art? Where? Okay, go for it.
It's intentionally art. So like it's self-expression for the sake of self-expression. Like it's art on purpose. That's
Art on purpose, so it's intentional. All right, so we've got two right answers. It's self-expression, but it's intentional. Okay. What else is it? Commodity. Particularly in this country, yes it is. What else is it? I couldn't hear you. All right. What else is it?
So in India, it's inseparable from spirituality, art and spirit.
All right. What else is it? Business? Well, okay. Business, commodity, all right. Representation. I'll add to that, it's a documentation of history. It's a documentation of history. It's a representation of your cultural norms and aesthetics. Art is all of those things. The thing to understand, but the thing to understand, art is part of our common existence. What if I were to tell you that doodling in your notebook is just as artistic, even though unintentional sometimes? Doodling in your notebook is art. It's an art form. Writing songs. Not every song that we write is going to be heard in public, but sometimes it's the way that we document our poetry. Now, what happens is because we have a tendency to separate to a certain extent, don't think of the common practices of art. Some people will write poetry just for the sake of writing poetry because they have these ideas. Sometimes they turn this poetry into a statement. Now, sometimes they turn this poetry into a song. Now, you had this gentleman who was a writer and he was an educator, and sometimes he wrote poems. And he'd written this poem and he sort of set it aside. And later on, he became the principal of a school in Jacksonville, Florida. And this is before the days of Black History Month. They would have President's Day. So he decided to take this poem and he took it to his brother. And he asked his brother, who was a musician, could you write something for this poem, and we're going to turn it into maybe a song and we can teach it to the kids at the school and they can sing it for President's Day. And his brother read the poem and said, we're going to sing this for President's Day? They're going to burn the school down. He said, no, not at all, because this is our story. This is our side of that story. Well, they want something that's going to celebrate Lincoln. He's like, no, it's not about celebrating Lincoln. It's about celebrating what supposedly Lincoln stood for. So he taught the students this song. They finished it some point December. Kids started learning it in December, spent January learning the tune. So President's Day came around. Slow it down. Lift every voice and sing till earth and I'm sorry. 1 second. Y'all need to stand up for this one. Allow me to put this in the proper context for everybody. The poet's name, or the author's name, was James Weldon Johnson. His brother, J. Rosamond Johnson, who wrote the music to go to this poem. Subsequently, this particular poem/song became the anthem for the NAACP when James Weldon Johnson became the president. It is now referred to as the Black National Anthem, as adopted during the Black Power movement in 1967. So that is why we stand for it. Give you the tempo. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmony of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the hope that the ancestors taught us. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. An example of art in commonplace. That wasn't a full-out songwriter. That wasn't a professional poet. That was not a composer who was celebrated as such. Those were people who took their regular gifts and skills and put them to use and created something beautiful. That is self-expression, that makes a statement, that is intentional, that thanks to the recording industry became a commodity. See the points? Now, if you understand those 7 roots of liberal arts, and you understand, or at least try to understand, those 4 sciences and how they interact, that's where you're able to use the true gifts and talents. That's where you're able to find them. Now you're all about to, or many of you are about to move on to college. when you go to college, your first 2 years ordinarily you spend on your general studies. Here's a little hint. Those general studies are all steeped in the liberal arts with sciences mixed in. So pay close attention to the courses that they tell you to take and the ones that meet the requirements. And you'll find that they all cross those 11 points. Do we have any questions so far?
What specifically are the 7 arts and the 4 sciences?
Good question. That's what you're going to look up when you get Wi-Fi. But excellent question. Hold that curiosity. Keep it. Go with it. You're off to a good start.
How did you learn the 7 arts?
I'm sorry?
How did you learn the 7 arts?
I had one time, here was a really funny thing. I was one of those weird kids who actually paid attention to the subs who came in to school. Because oftentimes they had the really interesting things to say. Well, one of them talked about the 7 arts, and I ended up, this was long before we had internet, I ended up going to the library and looking them up. And then realizing, aha, and this is what, when I got to college, realizing, aha, this is what they're making me study now. And this is what they, to some extent, attempted to have me study when I was in high school. But that was how I found out about them. Good question so far. Any other questions? Oh.
Who's your mentor?
Who's my mentor? It would be a list. My one in particular was a gentleman by the name of James Spruill. James Spruill was an actor and director on Broadway, and later on a professor of theater at Boston University, and was the founder of the theater company I ended up later helping to run. Theater company based out of Boston called New African Company. New African Company started in May of 1968. And it's the oldest continuous professional black theater in New England. But he was one of my mentors. His wife, the late Linda Patton, was one of my mentors. She was the person who taught me playwriting initially. But I can say mentors across several fields. But the two of them, I would say, probably had some of the deepest impact. Now, another piece of history, since we're in the month to talk about it. The company was called New African Company. One of the traditions in Black American theater, well, actually, I can say this goes across theater. You will sometimes have a theater company that when they open decide to honor a company that had already existed, and that's why they refer to themselves as new. Case in point, you at one point had the Actors Studio, you have the New Actors Studio. You had the, well, in the case of New African Company, 1968, New African Company took its name from a theater company that formed in 1821. Anybody here ever been to Greenwich Village? All right, a few of us, okay. If you go to Greenwich Village and you stand on the corner of McDougal and Bleecker, you actually want to stand in the northwest corner of McDougal and Bleecker. In that location, on that corner, was a restaurant in 1821 owned by a gentleman named William Brown. It was called the African Grove. It was a tea garden, basically. Well, he had a waiter there who was from Jamaica named James Hewlett. James Hewlett was a Shakespearean actor. James Hewlett convinced Mr. Brown to let him stage productions of Shakespearean plays on the stage in the back of that tea garden. Now, a little bit of a backtrack. New York City was a segregated city at that point. So this would mean that these were going to be all black productions of Shakespearean plays. This means that the African Grove, as a theater, also to a certain extent became a school. Advanced training and studies. So the African Grove Theater started staging productions of Shakespeare's pieces. They became tremendous hits, to the extent that they even were getting reviews by the New York Times, who basically renamed the theater the African Company. They had become so successful that by 1823, local aldermen had the theater burned down, and anybody found on the premises was to be beaten and possibly killed. So that was the end of the African Grove Theater. James Hewlett, on the other hand, had an apprentice actor working under him, because that was the way, by the way, actors were trained at the time. You became an apprentice under a master actor. Well, he had an apprentice by the name of Ira Aldridge. So James Hewlett and Ira Aldridge, with the African Grove Theater now closed down, decided to go to England. And when they went to England, pursued theater. And that's where they encountered the interesting form of British racism. The British press referred to James Hewlett as a trained monkey. You can find it in some of the Athenaeum pieces. Because they felt that since he came from Jamaica, he was just imitating the British actors that he saw while he was in Jamaica. But what was a true curiosity was this American Negro who could do such remarkable interpretations of Shakespearean speeches. Ira Aldridge, who was the son of a Methodist minister from New York City, became one of the stars of the European stage, performing in, I believe, over 300 Shakespearean productions. And he didn't just play Othello, by the way. He ended up succumbing to tuberculosis at a rather early age. But it was the tradition of the African Company that was being continued by New African Company in the city of Boston. Any questions on that?
Professor Peters, we should probably continue in Q&A in the faculty too. We're kind of running out of time.
Okay.
But, unless there are any last questions. There's a really cool band that I mentioned, the Grubalatos. The family band was big here. Check out the Grubalatos on Spotify and everything else, and you'll like it.
Oh. Oh, I'm sorry.
This is not a question. I just want to appreciate you for singing that song because, you know, I haven't heard that song in so long and it just brought back so many good memories, you know. Happy Black History Month, really.
Happy Black History Month. Thank you very much, but I got to remind you, it's more than a month. Happy Black History Year.
Happy Black History Year.